So we'll take a quick view of the traps now, and the reason why it's going to be quick, it's because we've really covered a lot of these already. There's still a couple key things that are still left though, like process, which we haven't covered, which is also related to the levels. We're going to have a look at that now. So some of the biggest traps, some of the things that we get caught in and spend far too much time in things that are not important or fail to understand what it is that we were supposed to be doing. A lot of this happens because we don't necessarily, even if we work with a teacher, we don't still have a big picture view. We only see kind of what we're involved in. We have a very narrow view in front of us, and we have the things that we've done before, which may be indicating that we need to be going in a certain direction. But there may be better ways, and we are never capable of seeing the full picture. So as much as possible, we need to try and predict what's most important, what's coming up next that we need to be fully engaged in. And this is before we talked about being the general and the soldier. And you need to basically have some time that you put aside that you're journaling. Now, you don't necessarily need to be writing if you don't want to, but really you need to be thinking, you need to be planning, you need to be spending time in that bigger picture view, trying to see, what did I just do? How does this fit in with the next thing? And what is my ultimate goal? Now, a lot of times I talk about practice and projects, and I've made several videos about those on YouTube. So I'll link those for you in your downloads here. I suggest you check them out. But really, practice and all of these skills that we talked about have to always be in service of something that we're looking to produce. Straight lines by themselves mean nothing. Really what they're for is, let's say, to construct a house or to make a space, to make a building, to make something like that. Practice in straight lines and doing them continuously until you either fall asleep or pass out is just not necessary. You need to always be thinking about how your practice fits into a project. If you're drilling ellipses, if you're doing hand mechanical coordination, the basic hand control skill training, then this really needs to be in service of something. You need to have a project, some sort of image that you are working towards. I'm saying all this stuff because there is a very large tendency when you're dealing with something that's very complicated to just forget about all the things that are actually more important and to just get stuck in what's immediate. I call that rabbit holing. Art is essentially this series of all kinds of different rabbit holes that you need to spend some time in, but then come out and go forward, because your goal is to get through that field, not to stay in a rabbit hole. But we tend to get so involved in what we're not good at that we will very likely spend a lot of time in something that in the big scheme of things just isn't that important. So always keep in mind where you're trying to go to, what your ultimate idea of your work is. Always keep that in mind and make small little projects and small little practice sessions that are somehow geared towards getting you closer to that. Never lose the big goal. And that's why you spend time in the general mode and not just as a soldier, so you can have a look at the field, see what's happening, remember what it is that you're fighting for, and then re-engage after that. So since we're primarily talking about drawing today, even though really this just applies to image making, it definitely applies to, let's say, if you're painting, understanding form and all of these things, design, knowledge, etc. These things definitely apply directly to that as well. These are some reminders. If you are looking at our roadmap here at our main screen, these are just some reminders of some of the more important things that we've talked about, that I'm trying to steer you from the thinking of a beginner that drawing is somehow just lines, or it's an outline, or it's contour. Line is just the expression of the thinking. It's kind of like, if you're reading something, it's saying that writing is all about the individual words or the lines that make up what a letter looks like, something like this. Well, it isn't really. I mean, obviously, the line is just a vehicle to create something, a symbol in this case, that would communicate something to whoever's seeing it. And this is the exact same thing that we do with drawing. So drawing isn't about the lines. It's not trying to get those lines. Those lines are a result of the things that are in our scene. They're a result of our thinking, of our exploration, of our iterations, of our design. Drawing is essentially visual thinking. It's everything in your image without the value and the color, like Craig Mullins said. Value being differences of black to white, or tone if you prefer. Because it's everything in the image, it's the basis of the visual language. It determines the level of expression, the level of sophistication that your final image will have. If your perspective is broken, if your figures are not sitting correctly in space, if they're foreshortened and distorted in incorrect ways, then no matter how lofty your goal and your story might be, you will fail on the execution, and whoever is looking at your image will more than likely focus on what's wrong with it rather than what's right with it if something is obviously very wrong. It requires study and training, so it requires information and requires drilling of that information. It requires converting information into practical, applicable skills. It's the difference between being a theorist and a practitioner. A theorist might understand everything that's happening and they might have more facts to support their understanding. They might be able to recite certain things, but it really isn't about that. It's about making things in this case. One thing that's interesting about drawing and about the visual language is that we can read visually. We can all look at the world and we understand what we see intuitively, implicitly. You never have to be taught to see. Everything that you see, you can understand. But we need to learn to write. And this is again that problem of having so much knowledge and so much understanding but not be able to execute on it. If there's anything that you're not getting and you feel like you won't be able to get, that you have tried so many times it's just not possible, you need to spend more time on that thing. There's a reason why they say that it takes 10,000 hours to develop expertise. Now, the 10,000 hour rule isn't really a rule. There is no such thing. You can't really put a number on something like that. But they're saying that within 10,000 hours, they see significant changes in the brain of practitioners. So that's all that you need to know. Essentially, you need to spend a huge, massive portion of your time working deliberately at a skill in order to transform your brain. Learning happens in the brain. Now, if you just read about something, then let's say the usability potential of that thing is very small, meaning that you've read, let's say, about 1 million different things. Now, what's the likelihood that you're going to remember what it is that you read last Wednesday about some obscure subject? What's the likelihood that you're going to remember that when it's important? It's virtually zero. But if you are spending time daily on that same subject, it will no longer be obscure or vague. It will be something that's in the forefront of your mind all the time. This is something called priming. You'll have that ready to fire essentially in your brain. Now, the more that you study about this thing, and more importantly, the more that you practice that knowledge. So with perspective, like we talked about earlier, the more time that you spend actually drawing on these concepts. So let's say you find out about 1-point perspective. Start deconstructing everything around you. Start looking around and when am I in 1-point perspective? When is it that 2-point perspective happens? What do different lenses do? Put yourself in many, many different situations. Be looking down, be looking up, and draw that out. Don't just try and understand it intellectually by looking at images. Draw it until you can do it, because that is the ultimate goal, to be able to do something. We're making the usability potential higher. Instead of just having read something once or having basically just one experience with something, we're having so many experiences with it that our brain starts storing all of these different patterns that go with that. So let's say you're looking at 1-point perspective and you do it over and over and over. At some point, your brain encodes the fact that in 1-point perspective, these things normally happen. So even if you're not actively thinking about what it is that you're doing, your brain is there just waiting to check, waiting to just, okay, these things normally happen. Hey, we missed something. So that's why sometimes an artist who is more skilled will have an intuition. They'll just have a feeling that something feels off. They'll say it doesn't feel right, it feels off. They'll add something to balance something else out. This is how they're able to do that. They're able to do it because of all the previous experiences that they've had. These are called mental representations. It's a concept by Anders Ericsson in his book Peak, and he talks about the fact that we store these different mental representations of a problem. So imagine, let's say, that you have a beginner chess player and a grandmaster chess player. Now they're both sitting at the same board. The beginner they're just playing, let's say, their first game. They're still trying to think of which piece was called what and how is it that they're moving. The grandmaster that's played, let's say, 10,000 games, they're looking at that board and they're seeing 10,000 different happenings that have occurred on that board. Anytime that beginner moves, that grandmaster is seeing moves ahead. They're seeing different games that they've read about, that they've played themselves, something that they have watched or heard about. All of these different things are coming together. They have previous experience. Even though it's a new game, they have all of these variations on each and every one single thing that's happening. They have 100 moves for every one move that the beginner has. So the beginner might just be playing this innocent little game, just trying to feel things out. The grandmaster is looking at them like, I got you, like this is your last move. So to them, they're the shark, and the beginner is just swimming around, They're like the Little Mermaid. They're just exploring. They're just having fun, not seeing how they're headed for the shark's jaws. That's why with a professional, you can't really say that something took them 1 hour. And I think this is an anecdote from Picasso. He drew something and someone told him, hey, this took you 10 seconds. How come? And he said, it didn't take me 10 seconds. It took me 30 years plus the 10 seconds. Moving forward, quick reminder, drawing is geometry. It's the structure. And then over top of that, what we actually see, the surfaces, those are the result of light being applied to that underlying abstract idea of structure and geometry. We don't necessarily get to see the geometry directly. We see the light, the surfaces that are over top of that. And we see those through tone, through color. So not just lines, geometry. Solve problems individually. This is something that is another limitation of our brains, and that's why we try and detangle these things as much as possible. We can essentially only think about one thing at a time. So if you have a compound problem like drawing plus light at the same time and you're not experienced, your likelihood of failing is quite high. If you're trying to design and imagine things and also you're not very good at drawing at that stage, you can't really, let's say you're in the copying level, you're still working on your mechanical skills, your likelihood of failure is extremely high. And that's because you can't think of design and construction and try and get proportions right if you're already struggling with that. So too many things equals very high probability of failure. So isolate and train individually. Cause and effect, always try and be thinking of why things look a certain way. Always try and dig deep for what's happening so that you can investigate things and then use those mental representations to make your own work better, so that each and every piece, each and every study is making each and every later study better. So thinking, not tools or style. I'm trying to make the point here that drawing isn't really about the tool that you're using. If I'm using a pencil, that doesn't mean that I'm drawing. If I'm using a brush, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm painting. But a lot of times we'll classify these things based on the tool that we're using. And that's not really accurate, because you can really draw with anything. You can draw with a paintbrush for sure. It just depends on the thinking that you're applying. Now you can also paint with a pencil. And I saw Jeffrey Watts do that once. He was doing some head drawings in one of his courses, and then he said, well, now I'm just gonna use my pencil as a paintbrush. I'm just gonna paint with it. And then he turned it on its side and he started, instead of doing lines and instead of doing structure like what we were looking at before, he essentially just started filling in the shapes directly. So after my brain rebooted, after I had to process what it is that he just said and what that means, he was essentially saying that the tool, the particular tool that we're using, doesn't really determine what it is that we're doing. It isn't the tool, it's the thinking, and it's the knowledge, and it's the training. A pencil is essentially just a piece of charcoal in a stick. It doesn't get any more basic than that. So if you're worried about which pencil to use, just don't sweat it. You're using a stick with a thing of dirt in it. So styles or different rendering techniques or any of those, little tricks and things like that, these are all secondary. What's primary, what's underlying all of the different drawings that we saw today, all the different images, is form and structure. It's thinking about the geometry, about the volumes that are in your scene, and then if you are going for, let's say, a tonal drawing or a painting, then applying over top of that the light. But it's always about thinking what is in your scene. How do these different objects interact? How are things affecting each other? It's always the cause and effect relationship. Style is secondary to that. Again, it's kind of like the accent rather than the study of a language. If you want to be a writer, you want to be a very good user of language, which is the equivalent of our drawing, of our form and structure. You don't want to just have 50 different accents, but you don't know how to say anything and no one understands what it is that you're saying. A good drawing, regardless of style, will always have good structure. It will always be correct in the structure that matters most. If it's a head, it will have correct anatomy. It will have good proportion. Now, even if they're stylized, let's say, even if something is very much distorted, it will still have a structure that supports that distortion. So let's say if you're having an anatomical stylization. I have this image here from Evan Amundsen. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Sorry about that. But you can see this guy is obviously very stylized. These proportions are very pushed. Look at the small eyes, look at the massive nose, but yet they sit in perspective. The forms are all correct. So the illusion is powerful enough to support the exaggeration. So you need to know there are things that you can push and that you can break, and there's things that you really can't play with. And if you're going with something, so this looks quite realistic, if you're going for realistic, you can't really break the camera. So you can't push your perspective into such a way that it becomes unreadable, unrecognizable. Space needs to be something that people understand when they're looking at the image you're creating. This is essentially kind of like a window into a world that you're looking into. You're just looking at this little dude smoking his pipe. If the window that you're looking through was wobbly and weird all over, then it would make sense if he's also distorted. But if everything looks correct and all of a sudden something jumps out, then that is an incongruency. And like with any magic trick, like with any illusion, people are looking to see where they're being tricked. And if you have something that grossly stands out and breaks the illusion, then people will be looking at that. Okay, no process. So this is going to be a big one. Process is essentially the strategy that you use, the planning, the reflection. This is the thinking that goes behind your image. Before you even start with your shapes, volumes, etc., this is the research that you'll do beforehand. This is your use of reference. This is your knowledge that you will have gathered beforehand. This is how you attempt your training as well. This is the ability to take what you've done and carry it forward rather than constantly be struggling with the same problems over and over again. If you're training and your training is purely grinding, meaning that I'm going to do 100 whatever a day, and you do your 100 whatever a day as early as you can, as much as you can, as fast as you can, and you have distractions going on and you're not really thinking about what it is that you're doing, how can you possibly encode a meaningful pattern that will support your future learning? There's no way that this could happen. No process means no improvement. And it also means a high likelihood of failure. Even if you're experienced, if you don't have a good process, if you're not doing your research, if you're not gathering your reference and all the images that you're going to be using in order to create what it is that you're making, if you just go in cold but you're not prepared, if you don't have that training that would be necessary and you don't put in the time in the process, your likelihood of failing is sky high. So this is why I have process as a multiplier to the levels. So let's say that you are a very experienced artist. Let's say that your level of skill, so let's say that your skills are level 100. Let's say you're really good at what it is that you're doing. But let's say your process sucks. Let's say that you are normally lazy. You don't do research. You don't practice before you start something. Or maybe you go back and forth a lot. Maybe you leave mistakes on your canvas and then continue forward, and then you know you're gonna have to come back because at skill 100 you know you're gonna have to. So this is just pure laziness at this stage in preparation. And maybe you also have many different things that you're doing at the same time. You're checking your phone, you're going on social media, you have a movie that's playing, you have a small dog that's attacking your leg, maybe you're doing this whole thing in a swamp. So all of these things together compounding, let's say, give you a score, a process score of, let's say, 0.1. Well, then when you multiply these together, you get an overall result of 10. This is all you get. Now, let's say you're an inexperienced artist. Let's say you're not very good, but let's say you're very diligent about what it is that you do. And you prepare, and you make sure that whatever preliminary drawings you can do, if you're going to draw, let's say, a forest scene, and there's going to be some different trees and some bushes and maybe like an animal of some sort, you're going to draw those beforehand. You're going to find what trees exactly are going to be in there. You're going to practice those a couple times. Maybe they won't be great, but you'll have some sort of idea of what's happening. You'll practice your perspective. You'll try and figure out the scene. You look for some similar scenes that have been done before. You look at some more experienced artists and what they do. You'll look at some photography and see what makes the scene look better. Maybe you look at for different lighting ideas, things like that. So you're really solid on preparation and your skill for the moment. So if you have that amount of diligence and you're that into what it is that you do, let's say you currently have a skill of 10, but your preparation is at 100. Well, then your end result might end up being, so this is kind of unrealistic, but let's say it ends up being 1,000. Now, it's not necessary that your 1,000 will beat this guy's 10 because maybe he's just so far ahead that his overall score of 10 beats your current 1,000. But if you keep that 1,000 going, and as your skills grow and grow and grow, you will start surpassing people that are not putting the same preparation in there. And it's not about surpassing others. It doesn't really matter how you compare it to anyone else or any of that stuff. But if you care about your work and if you are willing to put in the time and the effort and you care about what it is that you do, this will pay off for you. You may not see it within a week or a month, but you do that over a year, you will see tremendous payoff. And maybe that year is not enough. Maybe you need another year. You keep doing that same level of rigorous practice, you will inevitably progress. I can't guarantee you that you'll be the best or that you get to the top or that you'll get to even where it is that you want to get to, because your goals might be incredibly high. You may have very high standards, but I can guarantee you improvement. And I can also guarantee you that as you improve, you will more than likely surpass your initial ideas of where you might have ended up. And the things that you thought were impossible or that you couldn't foresee before, you will now have things that you may change how you see your future development because of the things that are possible now that you didn't really see before. This happened to me many times when, for instance, when I realized that I could study objects through drawing, that immediately became one of my focuses, and I dropped almost everything else that I was doing before that I thought was more important, because when that became an option, I just liked doing that so much, that became my priority. I started doing that primarily. And the final one here, my school does it this way. This is essentially just trying to say, stay open-minded. I don't really subscribe to any school. Like, I'm not a traditionalist and I'm not necessarily all about the digital stuff. I think they can all work together and they all have something to learn from each other. I think the digital way of doing things is incredibly powerful because it gives you all these procedural ways, these faster ways of generating things. So in terms of design, I think it's amazing because traditional approaches have to be more linear. But the fact that they're more linear makes them far more rigorous. You have to think things through and you have to plan and you have to do things in such a way and such a strategic way that really digital never requires you to do that. And you may end up missing on that massive part of training that is so good, not just for art, but just in terms of making you a better problem solver, in terms of making you a better person even. Because these are things that challenge your thinking, they challenge your discipline, they challenge your patience. I think these are things that are invaluable. So I'm just trying to encourage you here to consider. If you're in one camp, just be open-minded to the other camp. I've taken courses and sometimes I've heard people say, well, I just don't see things that way. And I think if you are in a course like that and you hear something like that, then that closes you off to a potential way of doing things that you may have actually enjoyed, that you may have actually found enriching to your art process. So with that, I just say keep an open mind and try different things. If you ever get bored with what it is that you do, and if you don't want to be spending time in, let's say, video games or something like that, do what I do. Just find something that's related to art, but not necessarily very close to what it is that you're practicing right now, and just try that. Try a piece of software. Try some 3D modeling if you normally just do drawing. Try some digital drawing or try some traditional drawing. Try a new medium. Just change things around a bit, but keep the general theme consistent. That way, no matter what it is that you're doing, you're still engaged in the same one thing, in this pursuit of art, but you're still getting to have some fun.